it would be called a folly or an installation, but it's too wrist-cuttingly serious for those labels. I'm not quite sure you're a card-carrying wrist cutter yet, but it looks like you might be headed there. The tower's the epiphany of an absolutely unique era of design exploration, as you know. I'm hoping it's enduring, but we know how delicate Lenin's steel sections are. So for all the usual pap about the durability of building, we both know how precarious, how fragile these results are. And fragility is certainly your subject too. We've been taught to call the tower constructivism, not to be confused with its sardonic stepsister, deconstruction, which, as we both know, has very particular psychotherapeutic problems. Psychotherapy is probably not your venue yet, but I think it's fair to say for your adherents, the constructed work has the most positive therapeutic aspect. Shukhov's Tower was built in the 1920s, a period of time which continues to inspire because it posits the promise of a colossal reimagining. How might the built world be redefined as new architecture? Naive though we all may be. But to be empirically fair, that history also carries the tensions between what we dream and what we realize. And as we've discussed from time to time, sometimes those contradictions tantalize and frustrate. And then all of a sudden it comes out of the ground in Moscow or Guangzhou or Los Angeles, and as you well know, the results confirm both the toughness of the game and the triumph of the achievement. And your work insists on the tension between those contradictory prospects. What was essential to Shukhov, and what in a different form I've always associated with your work, was the integration of an implied social perspective with investigations of technique, fabrication, engineering, and aesthetic vision. The Russians continue to call Shukhov simply an engineer. And in that sense, you're on the way to becoming a consummate engineer. I introduced a friend of ours at a lecture the other day, and it was not so much the work that was intriguing, but his conclusion, so I want to repeat it. He remarked simply, and by the way, he's 75 years old, "I'll see you all in 5 years, and my work will surprise you yet again. Count on that." So I want to say the same to you, George. I expect to introduce you again in 5 years, and the SCI-Arc community anticipates that the spirit of your work will continue to make the discourse dance. Be advised, your next lecture is on the SCI-Arc calendar. All the best to you and your family. Love, Eric.
Thank you, Eric. I'm really happy to see everybody here today. I started teaching at SCI-Arc in 1992, way back in the old Santa Monica building, and been a part of every building ever since, including the tent. And I really feel like my practice has been completely intertwined with this community. Not only have a lot of the people that have worked with us over the years come from SCI-Arc, but I feel like I've been a part of a kind of family that's really supported our research and our daily endeavors. So I want to really make that clear at the beginning of this lecture, that a lot of what I'm going to show you tonight is a conversation that we've had really with SCI-Arc, within SCI-Arc over the last 10, 12 years. So what I want to do tonight is just run through a few stories, tell a few stories that begin with a small scale piece that we did for the installation of in the gallery last year. And some of you have already seen this and experienced it, but I want to use this piece to introduce one theme in our work, which is the integration of technology into the making of space, and also the integration of different media into really shaping and designing an experience. And that's going to be the first theme. The second theme will really be more about living. So if the first one's about playing and working, the second one is living. I'm going to conclude with a kind of third theme that really has to do with the city, and beginning with shopping and some of the kind of shopping spaces that retail spaces that we've been involved with. So the first project is called Blow Up, and it occupies gallery about 30 feet by 60 feet at SCI-Arc, about 24 feet high, which is about the full height of the gallery. We weren't given a lot of money, about $6,000. We were asked to do something that would say something about our work and how we approach what we make. We had a 3-month run, and we decided that instead of doing something that would be kind of typically representational, we wanted to really make a kind of one-to-one experience, design something that everybody could come in and experience as space, as a kind of full-scale, not a mock-up, not a model, and not a kind of anticipation of some subsequent reality, but reality, and really get rid of the kind of gap, the delay in between. The other goal, or the other kind of intention, was to make something that would help us, that maybe would eventually inform what we do in our work at whatever scale, at a small scale, at a room scale. But perhaps, maybe it's utopian, but maybe perhaps at even a city scale. And we'd always been interested in form and the relationship between form and how people might behave when confronted with form, with geometry. And one of the things that we decided to experiment with in this particular installation was to make a kind of instrument, a very large-scale instrument, but an instrument that people would engage and interact with, and an instrument that would actually make the space. So the instrument is made up of 17 bladders, what we call bladders, that are constructed with vinyl sheets that were actually put together by a company called Vinyl Technologies, a local company that makes all kinds of inflatable toys, mattresses. They make the bags that contain the rockets that the space shuttle uses. And we sensitized each of the bladders with static switches. Static switches sense your electromagnetic energy and each of these surfaces then became a kind of trigger for a series of samples that were managed by a computer software program called Reason that was run off of a PowerBook computer that was hidden in one of the benches on the side and hooked up to a stereo system. The samples were just recordings of things going around, going on around the school, cars going by, birds chirping, Eric lecturing. I think there was one sample. Just random samples, some music samples, and enough so that we could actually rotate the samples, so that even though there were only 17 tracks, we could rotate it over time. So over a 3-month period, you'd get a variety of different samples. That's a close-up of one of the bladders with a sensor strip. That sensor strip allows that vinyl surface to actually be sensitive enough so that even if you come within about 4 inches of the surface, it picks up your body's electromagnetic energy, and it triggers a soundtrack. It also has this kind of very inviting form, and this is our close friend Tom Main, who at the opening is encouraged to give these things a hug, which a lot of people did, and it gets triggered whether you give it a hug or whether you touch it or just pass by. But to give you some idea of the experience, I mean, it's very difficult looking at two-dimensional pictures of this thing, so it's best to actually, or at least a little bit closer to represent it with a video. And this is on the last day of the installation, and I just went in on a Sunday afternoon and set up a video camera in the corner, and just let it run for a few hours. And there were a lot of people that came and went, and these were 2 students that actually found a way to use the thing to compose a pretty interesting original composition and to create a kind of soundtrack, a soundscape for this space. And in a way, it achieved something that we really had on our minds at the very beginning, but it was probably, we thought it was a little bit overambitious, which was the ability for 2 people to actually come in and to communicate and to interact and to somehow, if they were strangers or not, really use that space to learn it and to not necessarily experience architecture or whatever you want to call this as a kind of one-way exchange, or actually can't call it an exchange, a kind of one-way experience, but to really experience an exchange and to be able to see this as a space of exchanges, a space that's producing something. And I think this kind of soundscape experience, comes close to satisfying some of those goals that we had. So the next project came a few years before we did that installation, and was actually one of the first experiences that we had with a project that allowed us to really integrate a number of different media. Excuse me, power. Okay. This is a project for IBM E-Business, the E-Business division. And it was in 1999 that IBM went looking for a team to take on the total rebranding and redesign of their E-Business division, which at that time was responsible for 60% of IBM's revenue, yearly revenue. And IBM realized that no one actually knew that. IBM was still a company that produced software and hardware, and it was kind of very dry corporate culture, and they wanted somebody to really remake the spaces that they would work in, as well as remake the kind of image for customers, spaces that customers worked in with IBM and so on. So we, along with our partners, Imaginary Forces, a Hollywood-based film design company, we cold called IBM. We heard through the grapevine that there was this search. It wasn't really an open competition, but they had already interviewed 5 teams. And we came to them the last week of this search, and they said, yeah, well, show us what you got. We'll give you a week. We'll take a look at what you can produce, but be warned that we're looking at these kind of national advertising companies and agencies, and we went back after a week and we showed them that it was actually funny because we were the only team with architects. They didn't have, the other teams didn't think about integrating spatial design into the redesign of this part of the company. And so they gave us the green light and gave us about 2 months to go and look at their existing spaces. We produced a report and really tried to reverse some of the kind of practices that the habits that people at IBM had really grown comfortable with in terms of workspace. And they asked us to produce one prototype in Chicago that would demonstrate a new way of working, new ways of meeting with clients, internal meetings, and so on. So this Chicago E-Business Center is unfortunately the only one that was finally built, but it was intended to be a prototype for 6 or 7 centers across the US in major cities. The images that I'm going to show you, I'll just kind of walk you through, and then there's a video that shows some of the integration of video and sound and so on in the space. But these 2-dimensional images showed the sequence of spaces. That first one was, the reception area, the reception desk we designed to be made out of a solid piece of resin, and there are a series of closets that are on casters to the right of that, which are also solid pieces of, or solid one-piece resin casts. This is a gallery space and a kitchen area for serving food for special occasions, and then there's a series of kiosks that pivot in this mode. They're set up for individual viewing, and then they can be rotated, pivoted, so that you can make a group presentation as well. And the kitchen doors close up and become a kind of projection wall. Another view of the kiosks. Imaginary Forces, our partners on this project, produced all the content that are displayed on these video screens, projection walls, kiosks, and so on. The heart of this facility really is the conference room. In the conference, there are 3 conference rooms. This is one. Really takes on the American corporate office meeting room table, a kind of long hierarchical boardroom table, and offers a kind of less hierarchical, much more interactive and collaborative environment, where really the model for this table was a kind of round table, a Chinese restaurant table where everybody can reach for the Lazy Susan and get the same access to the food. And in this case, the idea was to really make sure that everyone had equal access to information. And in other words, there's no speaker, there's no podium, there's no PowerPoint show. the whole thing was rethought so that everybody would have a screen that's actually not even really a screen, it's a projected pool of light in front of them. Projectors are hidden in the ceiling, and that pool of light is a virtual screen. You can interact with it. There's a series of sensors that are embedded under the table that allow you to move a cursor around on that tabletop. But the idea was to create a series of simulations, games, to introduce complex ideas. And IBM E-Business is in the business of creating business models for their customers, and to explain a complex business model, it takes a little bit more than a PowerPoint show. And so the idea was to really use this kind of interactivity of the table to communicate and explain these complex ideas. This is a close-up of one of the stations. And so that pool of light, that screen, is just a projection from a hole in the ceiling. And that projector is connected to a Windows NT workstation. The underside of the table, this is a mock-up of the technology that we developed. By the way, we took on the contract to produce these tables because at the time no one in the US wanted to take the work. And we tried. We went to a number of fabricators, including a number of people that had just graduated from MIT Media Lab, and no one was willing to take it on except ones that charge exorbitant prices. And so we decided, IBM was not going to go forward with it unless somebody would take the job, and we, being naive and foolish, said we'd do it. And we went out and found subs and fabricators to actually engineer this thing. In this image, we developed in-house a very simple technology for embedding sensors under a table. And it's a piece of corian that's been milled out so that the thickness of the table goes from 3/4 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch within that one recessed area. And we simply took a Wacom tablet and set it into the depression, into that recess. And we found out that Wacom tablets are sensitive to the stylus that comes with a Wacom tablet, the stock stylus, within 1/4 of an inch of any thickness of material. So it could be glass, it could be solid surface material. And so that allowed us to get this kind of magical interactivity. This is an axonometric that just gives you some idea of how complex this table is. It's probably more complex than any house I've ever designed. The table itself really doesn't have much hardware exposed. That was the idea. We wanted the thing to be a table, a beautiful, elegant table, and everything is either above the ceiling or below the floor. It took a lot of work. It took us 8 months to really go from conception through prototypes and a series of reviews with the IBM managers. This is a part of our office at the time. We just moved into an empty office in Culver City, and the whole office was really dedicated to this project. And so, we were making cardboard mock-ups of the tables. This is probably one of the final versions, but we went through a lot of versions. And then, just to give you an idea of how really difficult it is to make something minimal and clean and, to hide things, this is what the table looks like, before you manage the cables, as they say. And then there were a whole set of very complex kind of layered drawings and an exercise in casting. We made all the parts for the data legs. These are the legs that bring the data cables up from the floor, and they're cast out of rubber. And we had all the casts made, custom made from aluminum parts. And these are some of the resin parts that we built. And these were about 2,000 pounds each, and were built in LA and then shipped out to Chicago. We developed custom flooring as well. These are terrazzo type floors that are made out of recycled bottle glass, and the bottle glass is mixed with epoxy. And some of the epoxy are clear epoxy bands, and others are kind of milky white. But they're quite beautiful because the light gets picked up by the bottle glass, and during different parts of the day, you get the reflection right up on the ceiling of morning light or afternoon light, and it gives the whole space a very different color. So this is a kind of tour through different parts of the space, following about the same sequence as the 2D images. This is the reception area with a series of video screens that are playing content, really kind of three-dimensional logos that were developed by imaginary forces. Those are two pivot doors that weigh about a ton each on aircraft axle pivots. This interface was written as original code in C++ by Peter Cho, who was part of the Imaginary Forces team, and it really is a kind of reaction to PowerPoint. It's kind of an anti-PowerPoint interface. The goal here was to have that magical moment where the lights go down and the technology appears magically, and the rest of the time it's just a table. The next project came directly out of our experience with IBM. This is a proposal for Sony World Headquarters in Tokyo. Sony had heard that we had been working with IBM for a few years, and were interested in our experiences integrating technology into the workspace. And so they invited us to participate in a competition. 14 international teams were invited to compete to design the new world headquarters in Tokyo. The brief actually was one of the most sophisticated briefs for competitions that we'd come across, because it was not just an architectural solution they were asking for. They really wanted the winning team to integrate workspace, which is the architecture, with what they called work tools, which is really the IT systems, and work styles, which is really a way of working, kind of new philosophy of managing workspace and workers and so on. And so the teams brought together a number of experts, not just architects, to rethink the entire way that office buildings are designed, but also leased and managed. Our proposal was in some ways a kind of reaction against the 100-year-old Misesian model of the continuous floor plate, the universal space, kind of flexible space that really is driven by the need for leasing agents to be able to make space as flexible as possible, so that they can lease to small companies as well as large companies. And of course, there's this whole industry called interior design that's necessary to make those spaces usable. And Typically, it takes about 6 months and several $1 million for a company to move into a space and to occupy it, to have it wired, to have it usable. Our idea was to make just-in-time space. What if you designed the space so that you could call on Monday and move in or called on Friday afternoon and you could move in on Monday morning? And what if Sony is one of the few companies in the world that really have the resources to provide technology and continually upgrade it? What if Sony could be a provider, to act as a kind of provider in the way that your internet access company provides technology? And what if work, and this was just a kind of prediction on our part, what if work in the future is project-based and you don't need to have continuous 60,000, 90,000 square foot office spaces? What if it was just like SCI-Arc and you had 20 people in a studio and those 20 people came from all around the world for a project for a few months, and then after that project's done, they fly off and they join other project teams. They're not necessarily loyal to one company. They're hired onto other projects with other companies. And this model of workspace would be a kind of support for this type of work, project-based work. Our conclusion was that if you really accepted those premises, you would have floor plates of about 500 square meters or 5,000 square feet, which would support 20 to 30 people. And those floor plates would perhaps be divided into spaces that would support collective work, that have two-story spaces perhaps. In some cases, or in other parts, in other zones, you'd have more individual work that is lower scale, smaller scale. So that was one system, the kind of module of the 500 square meter floor plates. The other system, the second system, is a kind of public space ribbon, a series of continuous ground planes that would literally connect the public directly into the core of the building, to the heart of the building. And this is more believable in the context of Tokyo, where section is actually something that's used in a building, as opposed to North American context, where the lobby space seems to be the only place where people off the street would have the energy to go. In the third system, there's a series of nodes that would contain things like conference rooms, the IBM E-Business Center level of technology that would be shared by everybody in the building as an amenity. So this would be the kind of time-shared technology that Sony, as a landlord, as a developer, would be able to lease to each tenant on a short-term basis. And each tenant wouldn't have to have the capital at the beginning of their enterprise to invest in this kind of high level of technology that IBM and Sony are able to do, but no one else can. This is one elevation, the south-facing elevation, and you see in this elevation some of the artifacts that result from the collision of the three systems. This is a part of that public ground plane system that kind of weaves its way through. This is almost like a ski jump or a hill inside the building that carves its way from one side, the south side, to the north side. And this view, you see the kind of stacking logic of these 500 square meter floor plates, one story and two story, and they create a kind of terracing throughout the building. Structurally, the building is really this matrix of those modules, the 500 square meter modules. And this was also a way to address the problem of the immensity of this site. The site that Sony is using is 100 meters by 100 meters, and the building code allowed for 100-meter height, so it's a 100-meter cube. Well, the typical American office building is only about 30 meters at most. So this is 3 times as wide, and it creates problems of light and air for the people at the center of the building. So the porosity of the building was also a kind of major problem, and that's why in this kind of stacking logic, there's a way for light to actually filter into the core of the building. These are typical floor plans, and you can see in these renderings that the floor plates would be quite varied from one side to the other. It's not a continuous plane, and it's almost like a kind of interior landscape. These are some model shots that just show some of the conditions. This is inside that one carve out of the south face, and suspended in that void is a long tube that contains all the bars and restaurants and the kind of food court type of facilities. We wanted to get that off of the public space. And this is an atrium in the center of the building that allows air and light to get to the inner offices. And this is a typical layout in one of those 500 square meter office modules. The competition was pretty demanding. They gave us 3 months, a chunk of money, and asked for schematic design with a firm bid at the end of schematic design. In other words, we had to work with a contractor, in this case Obayashi Construction, and we had to work out a buildable building. And, the winner would have to build a building for the price that was proposed. And it got to the level where we proposed systems of kind of small scale furnishing, and in this case, the furnishings would integrate things like servers, and so these are server walls that would allow for people to have that kind of rapid setup where you just move in a series of walls like this. This room has on casters, and all of the kind of wiring would be integrated into that. Well, we didn't win. We made into the final round, in the final 3. Hitoshi Abe won, SCI-Arc grad Hitoshi, and we were very happy for him. And in a way, it was a lucky break for us because that project got canned after 6 months, and so we kind of went away clean. But as a result, we got into a good relationship with Sony, and they liked what we did. We made a proposal that was probably a little bit too radical for their real estate people. The 500 square meter floor plate really does kill the leasing possibilities, and so it was a lesson we learned. I mean, that was a huge thing for us to depend on as a proposal, as a logic behind the proposal. But one of the things that came out of it was Sony decided to give us a chance to do some small spaces using some of the ideas that we developed for the 500 square meter modules, this kind of just-in-time office space. And so this is a project in Santa Monica for Sony Electronics. Sony Electronics has a series of design centers. In the US, they had 2, one in San Francisco and one in New Jersey. There's one in London, and of course the mothership is back in Tokyo. They decided to close down San Francisco and New Jersey and consolidate all of the designers in one office in Los Angeles so that they could be close to the movie industry and the music industry divisions of Sony. And so the space is for 35 to 40 people, and this is a plan. This is a model looking at it's kind of a worm's eye model. Looks up through the floor at the design studio, and this is a plan there's basically two zones or two wings, one that is a design studio and one that's more public and communal or collaborative, the conference rooms. This is a high security facility. No one actually gets to go in. They don't even have a sign on the door. Everything is kind of super secret with the design center because all the products are designed here. And so security was one of the big issues. And it's not a branding exercise. It's not really meant to be experienced by anybody but the people working there. And so what they really wanted here was a space that would support creativity. And one of the kind of highest priority requests for them was to create a space that would allow people to cross-fertilize ideas and be able to see what was going on in other project teams. This is the entrance reception area, which is the only real kind of clean and pristine space in the entire facility because it's kind of public face. But in this space, we got a chance to use a material that we hadn't used before. It's a custom plaster panel produced by a company called Modular Arts. So we produced a series of custom molds and produced these 32-inch by 32-inch panels for the walls. This is the studio side, which based on this idea of having a kind of series of parts and tools for working, it was really created with a series of volumes, in this case, that we call project boxes. And the project boxes are really meeting rooms, small meeting rooms, where design teams could camp out for a few months, the length of the project, without having to take everything down. And as opposed to a conference room where you really have to vacate the thing after the meeting, these project boxes would be a place where other teams could come in and see what was going on in the studio. There's another series of spaces that are more informal for reviewing work, sliding panels that run along tracks. This is a view into one of the project boxes. There are doors on both sides of this box, so when the doors are pivoted open, it really is quite transparent. As you're walking down the corridor, you'd be able to see into the project box and see the work up on the walls. This is the main conference room, which is a little bit more formal. And this is the vice president's office, which is a box itself, but it's totally transparent, and that was the request from the vice president to really have an acoustically separated space, but to still be part of the design studio. And this is the side of the conference room wing. So we've completed this project for Sony back in January, and the system was then, the system was used again in Shanghai. They asked us to also build a new design center for their China region or Asia region division, electronics division. And I don't have any images of that tonight, but it was a chance to kind of play out some of the ideas that we had invented for the, originally really for the headquarters building, and executed, produced for the first time for Santa Monica and then Shanghai. So this last project for the first theme, the kind of play work theme, is a project that we just started, and there's just a few preliminary images I wanted to show you, but this is another creative workspace facility for a large automobile company. Not supposed to say which, but They're not American, and it's a kind of skunk works, another kind of secret space without a sign. But in this case, the management wanted the space to be in the middle of a very urban fabric, in the middle of a busy kind of vital area of the city, and really wanted the designers to be able to just step out the door and be in the middle of the city and go down the street to a bar and meet and invent, and not be separated from the city, where typically these things are in kind of office parks, suburban office parks. So it's a very modest facility. It's a small room for about 10 people, plus workshop space, plus conference rooms and auxiliary spaces. But this is where they carve clay into cars and produce full-scale mock-ups, and there are panels on the storefront that allow for the full-scale mock-ups to be carried in and out of this space. And a big part of what they asked for was flexibility, so that the space could be reconfigured easily for any number of cars that are being designed at the same time. For us, it was a chance to do something that we hadn't had a chance to do before, which is to really make some interesting formal parts, literally using the car company's tools. At the first meeting, we'd been given a tour of their facilities, and this company has a building half the size of SCI-Arc filled with milling machines, and the most sophisticated shop in Southern California, probably, but it's dedicated to what they produce in-house. And so I just asked if we could use some of those tools. And you make things, we make things, let's make some things together. And they were very excited about it. They hadn't thought that architects would be actually interested in using those tools, but we're going to produce a lot of this project using their processes. So one of the problems that has to be solved in this facility is, again, security, privacy, and we have to provide a screen that really shuts out any visual access to the interior of the studio, but at the same time allows for light to filter through into the studio, and most importantly, gives something back to the kind of public side of this street experience, and it can't be turning its back completely to the public. This is just a close-up of this kind of skin cocoon that's being developed, which will be made most likely out of polycarbonate or acrylic, and the forms, they'll be drape formed using foam molds. The foam molds will be cut using this company's milling machines, and it's just a very simple kind of drape mold process. So that's the end of the kind of first theme, I guess, the work-play theme. A few projects I want to show very quickly are in the living space theme. We haven't done a lot of residential work, frankly, but we've had a few very good clients that allowed us to experiment with living. And one is Leon Max, who was also responsible for commissioning about 60 stores, women's fashion boutiques that I'll show you in the next group of projects. But he asked us to work on a house with him, and it's been about 5 years since beginning this project. We didn't have a site at the beginning, so that image of the site was actually just 2 years ago. He asked us to develop a kind of ideal villa. And the ideal, and this was his ideal, not necessarily ours, was to live in a circular house. And to somehow get that circle to work with a hillside and rooms. But the site that was eventually purchased by him is up in Malibu, just north of Malibu Pier. It's up at the top of the mountain there at about 2,000 feet. And it's quite a beautiful site. You get 180-degree views up and down the coast. This is a section through the center of the house. You enter from the second story, from the back of the house, really, up here. And the shell is this kind of drum, almost like a turret, and then the superstructure of the house itself is inserted inside of this concrete drum. This is a sequence approaching the house from the main road, from Paiuma Road, and you can see that really the house doesn't have a formal kind of front facade, and that was his ideal, that you would somehow just kind of sneak into this house from the back. This is the entry court, which is almost like a bathtub shape that then leads to a mezzanine level on the interior, and this is just inside the front door, where you get a view of the courtyard in the center. And I'll come back to this, but this is a kind of brise-soleil system, sunshade system, and this is the courtyard that you're looking down on the main level. There's a shading device that you see here that gives shade to that center courtyard, and then there's the pool and a series of gardens. Bedrooms are upstairs, and living spaces are downstairs. What we really want to do, and what he was hoping for as well, was to transfer some of that knowledge that we'd gained working with IBM and others in integrating technology, and to integrate some of that into a living space, a series of living spaces. So this is just a diagram showing some of the systems that we're playing with. That screen that's above, or the canopy that's above the courtyard, the circular courtyard in the center, is made up of a series of smaller elements that would be, we're investigating the use of nickel titanium as it's a shape memory alloy. So when this metal gets hot, it expands. When it gets colder, it shrinks. And so it's not really a mechanical device. The wire itself has this kind of built-in shape memory that adjusts to the temperature, and so the shadow patterns that are created by this in the courtyard would vary according to the temperature. Another system is this luminescent brise-soleil, which on one side blocks the light, and on the other has a series of panels that are made out of a flat light product. It's a zero-depth lamp. It's an electroluminescent coating on foil, so you can basically turn on your brise-soleil and it becomes a light source, and on the other side, during other parts of the day, it becomes a light blocker. And other things, other toys. I mean, that house in Malibu we've been working on forever, it seems, and we just got coastal commission permission, which took a year and a half to go ahead with it, but I don't know when it'll ever get done. I mean, it's a kind of laboratory of experiments for us, and I'm not complaining about it, but on the other end of the spectrum of practice, you have clients that actually want things to get built quickly. And so I'm going to just show you a project that was completed literally like this week. And I just have a few snapshots that I took yesterday when I went by to visit them. It's a house in Hancock Park for a couple, elderly couple that have a really incredible contemporary art collection. They've been very supportive of young artists, and they were bursting in their old house, bursting with artworks. And so what they asked for is a lot of wall space to create a gallery, essentially. And they wanted a second bedroom or a master suite and a larger closet and so on. But what they really wanted was this gallery space. This is a model that shows the back of the house facing the garden and pool. And from the front, you really don't even see the house. This is from the street, from McCadden. And so it's a two-story addition to the back of an existing house, kind of a classic LA type. The front house is a 1920s Spanish colonial number, and this model shows the existing, and then really we're building this entire 2,000 square foot structure behind it. So, again, as you can see, you can't really see this thing from the street. And that's important because this is in Hancock Park, where there's a historical overlay, and you can't actually build anything contemporary in Hancock Park. We had a hell of a time trying to get this past the city. But as you come through the old part of the house, this is the front door. You enter into the existing house, and you get 7.5 foot ceilings, and then suddenly the space kind of explodes up, and we totally maxed out the height limit here. We went to 30 feet, even though it's a two-story house, and gave them this space where you could probably hang 2 VWs, Vugs, end to end on the wall, and then over this wall here is the master suite, the bedroom on the second floor. This is looking the other way, which looks into the garden and backyard. And as you can see, even though we just finished, they've already hung everything, and it's bursting already with their artwork. This is a kind of hall that looks into the back garden pool. So this is the hall. And a part of the hall is a stair that leads to the second level, which is tucked into the corner. So this is last night, and so there's the stair, and then the second level is really another gallery space. This is the stair leading up. Looking back down, and the bedroom / gallery. And so this is where the bedroom looks back down into that 2-story space, 30-foot space, and then from the bedroom, there's a kind of clerestory here, and on the other side of that is the master bedroom, bathroom, and that is connected to an outdoor patio. And this wall of glass has a door in it which allows you to get outside. And so the bathroom is really this extension of outdoor space into the bedroom. It's the shower and bath. So the third stream of work in the office, the retail, shopping, city. As I mentioned earlier, Leon Max has been a very good client and really supported the office for a number of years with a lot of work. The work is a series of stores, each about 3,000 square feet. We did about 60 over the last 5 years. So 60 times 3,000, what is that, 180,000? If it was one building, we would have built a 180,000 square foot building. But it's a serial work. It's a module that has been multiplied, produced all over the country, actually the world too, in Japan and China. But what he asked us for at the very beginning was to come up with a system, a module that could be manipulated, transformed to fit into a number of circumstances. And I mean, he knew his stuff. He'd already been in business for about 15 years when he came to us, and he had a first generation of store build-outs. And most of those stores end up in malls, sometimes in outdoor locations, but mostly in malls. And you get a tenant space in the mall, mostly they're the same. You get 3,000 square feet, slightly different proportions. They have a storefront at one end, service kind of entrance, and core at the other end. And you have a very strict budget. Can't be more than $140, $150 a square foot. Can't be $160 a square foot. So this was not working with Prada. This is working with your typical retail operator. So I'm going to run through these diagrams. These are 24 of the 60 stores that we did over the last 5 years. And in each one of them, you see a blue element and a kind of yellow element. The blue is a inner liner, and the yellow kind of ghost image of a shell is the space you get if you take retail space in a mall. As you could see, the proportions and areas vary slightly, but they all require more or less the same thing. The way that we came up with the blue wrapper or liner element is, it's not a unique model of how to approach something like this today. It's a continuous surface kind of strategy that's quite popular and common these days. But in this case, it has a very specific goal. We literally laid out all of the clothing that needed to be displayed in that store in a flat sheet, plus all the lighting, plus all of the HVAC systems, plus all the alarms, web cameras, signage, and just folded it so that you get this kind of sometimes distorted, sometimes cut up result. But in every case, in all 60 stores, you have the same system of clothing racks, same system of shelves, same system of lighting, because they buy in bulk. They buy enough lighting for 20 stores at a time. And so you already know that you're going to be able to continue that pattern, and everything gets laid out in a very similar way by us, and then you start to distort the thing or pull it and push it so that it fits into a specific set of circumstances. I'm just showing you two that are local. The first one was in Pasadena. The second one is in the Beverly Center. The lighting is really important for displaying merchandise. The floor is very important as well because it takes all the wear and tear. So we learned a lot. I mean, when I got out of school, I thought I was going to work for a good designer apprentice, start my own office, and then do some restaurants and cafes and bars, and then graduate to civic buildings and Olympic villages, But it doesn't happen that quickly. And when I first started practicing, we did a lot of retail. And it was just because people came to us with that work, and we got pretty good at it. And still waiting for the big break to headquarters buildings for Sony. But in the meantime, we actually learned a lot. After doing 60 stores for Leon, I mean, it took me a while. I'm kind of slow, I guess. I figured out there's something missing in how shopping malls are made, and that's that they're not cities. They're what's good about a city is everything that's missing in a shopping mall, and most people know this, I guess. But the diversity, the malleability, the kind of exchanges that you get in bazaars and the kind of things that we love as architects, medieval markets, bazaars. These are all things that you don't get in malls, and we, as architects, we try to design vitality and messiness into malls, but what I figured out was that no matter how talented you are, you actually can't change the thing. It's got a logic, and it's a leasing logic and planned city. And it's a project for one of the largest developers in Japan, developers of shopping centers, a company called Jesco. And Jesco was, it's not that old a company. They started to produce malls based on the Gruen model, the American shopping center, which was only possible in Japan really within the last 20 years or so, because prior to that, real estate laws in Japan made it impossible for developers to accumulate that amount of land and to control that amount of leases. And the rules changed, and so it allowed for a shopping center, American-style shopping center, to be developed by companies like Jesco, and they spread out all over the place, all over suburban Japan. 20 years later, Jesco realized that, okay, well, this model is a bit dead, and much like the American shopping center, there are a lot of dead malls, or soon-to-be dead malls. And Jesco wanted to develop a new model that would be much more complex, urban, messy, what have you. And so they came to us with that question, how can, even though, I mean, we're not mall architects, and we really didn't have any experience with 1.5 million square foot buildings. This is a very large building. But they were interested in some of the kind of research that we've been doing, and especially in our experience as architects for the tenant side. So in this mall, which is in Nagoya, they decided to use this as a kind of guinea pig to develop a prototype for others that would hopefully be built in other similar contexts. This context is not suburban, it's actually inner city. It's in an industrial area of Nagoya, and the site was owned, or is owned, by a company that produced steel parts for companies like Toyota and Mitsubishi, car companies that are based in Nagoya, that were founded in Nagoya. But because of globalization, a lot of these contracts are going offshore, being produced in other countries in Asia, and so this company was going broke. And instead of calling it quits, they decided, well, we've got the land, we've got the capital, what can we do? And they invited Jesco to become their partners and to basically develop this property as a mixed-use shopping center. And they retrained their staff, their managers, especially, to manage this mall. So there are a bunch of steel workers working in this mall now. And so, yeah, it's a very unusual story. You wouldn't necessarily find that situation in the US, but they asked us to come up with a model that would be more urban. And one of the, it was a tough assignment because they already had this model, the American model, the kind of typical, dumbbell with department store one end, department store the other end, gallery in the middle. And they didn't want to completely throw that out. But one of the contributions, I guess, we made to this model was to augment the Galleria with a series of cross-grain elements, which are the kind of noodle-like pieces that bridge across the Galleria. And we were hoping, would act as a kind of middle scale space. In other words, if the Galleria is the main street, the Ringstrasse, or the kind of major thoroughfare, these noodles would act as side streets and would be more contestable spaces, like a medieval town in Trastevere in Rome, for example, where you have a series of different uses over the course of a day. people moving into those streets for selling vegetables during one part of the day or selling coffee in another part of the day, these spaces aren't as controlled as the main spaces. At least that was the hope. I mean, so we had to talk to leasing people, and mainly it was the leasing people, into allowing for this kind of flexibility where a tenant could actually go outside of their tenant boundaries and take over space and kind of revitalize these side streets. Some of the noodles burst through the front and actually create special conditions that are quite desirable, like this Just Go sign, which becomes a fitness gym or something, and cafe, restaurants, and so on. The other way that we approached this was that we knew that we wouldn't have complete creative control all the way through this process because we were working in partnership with an executive architect, Niken Seke, who would actually do a lot of the final construction documents production. And our role was to create almost a code that would allow JustGo in the future, if this prototype would play out in other contexts, to use some of the systems to plan this new model. So, for example, we didn't really care how the noodle's curved, right? I mean, there are radius, there's a kind of way that these pieces can go from one end of the building through the Galleria to another end, but depending on the needs of the tenants that are leasing those spaces, they could change the geometry, and most likely the leasing people would change the geometry to make spaces larger or smaller. So in that way, it's more of a kind of code that comes with its own set of tectonics and proportions and so on, but it's not something that is completely designed by a design architect. In our case, we had to let go of some of this control. This was a model at the end of schematic design that proposed a certain structural solution to how to bridge over the Galleria. This is a section of vertical circulation through the Galleria. And these are a little bit earlier in terms of the articulation of these noodles going through the Galleria. So we got, this thing actually got built, and we learned a lot of lessons, and it was a very difficult problem, and I think we had to acknowledge that we couldn't change the leasing logic, and it was really not going to change the level of control that the landlord of this mall would have over the tenants. So there was no way that we would get the kind of messiness and vitality that we had wished for. So the next experience we had actually came out of having done that JustGo project, because we could show that some developers in China invited us to go over and look at a problem they had. They flew us over to Shanghai and then to Zhengzhou, which is off the Yellow River, and this developer, a young guy my age, had developed something like 50 acres of housing outside of a city called Zhengzhou, which is the capital of Henan province. And this is phase 4. In 5 years, he's gone through 4 phases, and it's a mess. And but he realized that he needed to bring in people that could start to design some of the other parts of the city that he had not really been concerned that much about. He'd been concerned about housing because there's a huge need for housing. But in this city, Zhengzhou, there are 1 million people, and it's growing fast. There are 10 other satellite towns, or really cities, within an hour of Zhengzhou that each have 1 million people. So within that one hub, there are 11 million people. And there are 3 modern shopping centers. Everything that came before those 3 shopping centers were traditional markets. And so there's this huge demand for contemporary shopping centers. So this is actually the site that he gave us, this kind of L piece, and then their main thoroughfares just beyond that. Across the street, just kind of a curious thing to show, but that's like a builder's emporium, or that's where all the supplies are purchased for building these 50-acre developments. This is one of the malls that it's probably 3 or 4 years old, developed by a Hong Kong developer, I think. I don't remember the specifics. But we had a chance to walk around Zhengzhou, and it's quite wonderful. It was the middle of the summer, and everybody was outside. It was probably 100 degrees and 99% humidity. But this is the People's Park in the center of the city, and everybody's out playing pool and ping pong on concrete tables. And we got the sense that there's a real need for open space and for open public space. And so that became one of the driving kind of ideals for the series of studies that we did to propose this shopping center to this developer. And I'm not gonna show you in detail these 10 ideas, but just to kind of give you a flavor of where we were going with this. In almost all cases, the basic idea was to turn the sectional configuration of your typical mall or street 90 degrees and try to really create a series of surfaces that would be used in section as public surfaces, public parks or plazas, and to kind of break down the controlled zones of a typical mall and to allow for the streets to go back inside the mall, kind of reclaim some of that space. The names are really for us because there's definitely something lost in the translation. Especially the wedgie. But there are studies that led to one scheme that we showed the client. And the scheme is based on the idea that as in North America, this is beginning to happen in China, there's this separation between big box store retail, small box retail, lifestyle center retail, housing, public space. Everything gets built in its own precinct, and they're separated by huge thoroughfares. And this client, in our initial discussions, was actually interested in the idea of reintegrating all of those different precincts, and why not stack those different functions in the city into a much more intense use of land, much more urban use of land. So this is just a kind of sectional model of one part of the very much larger whole, but it proposes that parking is below grade. There's a big box store zone on the first level. There's a smaller box retail, lifestyle center, whatever you want to call it, on the second and third levels. And then there's a kind of landscape level where a public park would be located. And then above that, a series of housing blocks that would be built that hover above the landscape. And the landscape becomes a kind of buffer zone between the more private use, which are the housing blocks, and the more public use or more commercial use, which are the zones below the park. And somehow all these are integrated through vertical circulation. If needed, in other cases, people actually don't want to know that they're above a big box retail store, and so there's separation. We played around with this idea in a series of very schematic diagrams and section, and there's a series of these vertical connectors, each with different themes. bamboo court, and you see the kind of big box store builder's emporium existing on the first level, and smaller box retail on the second level, parking on the third level. And anyway, that didn't get us anything built in China, but we're still looking. And at the same time, you know, it was good. It was a good exercise, and we've made about 3 or 4 trips over to China over the last 2 years, and still haven't found the right person to really work with. But it led to this last project, which I want to show you tonight. And how should I start? Okay. Last year, we were asked by the curators of the U.S. Pavilion at the Venice Biennale to participate in an exhibition called Transforming Type. They asked 6 architects from around the U.S. to take on a different type. We were given shopping centers, mostly because the editors or the curators of the show knew a little bit of our history. And some of the other types were sporting facilities, churches, infrastructural nodes, and high-rise housing. But yeah, we got shopping centers. And we decided to take some of that research that we'd been able to accumulate over the years and to come up with a hypothetical solution to a problem that we'd been observing, which is the dead mall. So this is an aerial of Richmond, which is a suburb of Vancouver, British Columbia, here in the background. This is the ocean, and this is the delta of the Fraser River Delta. I'm familiar with this area because I grew up around Vancouver, and I taught at University of British Columbia for a few years. And one of the things that is very unique about Richmond and Vancouver is that it has the highest concentration of Asian Canadians now in North America. A lot of them came from Hong Kong before and after 1997. Or, is that right? Anyway, yeah, as a kind of immigration policy, the Canadian government made it very attractive for Hong Kong, especially wealthy Hong Kong, to leave China and to come and settle down in Canada, and a lot of them chose Vancouver. The result of that is that there's a very different culture here that is unique, that has its own predilections, that has its own kind of needs, and it doesn't really mean that they're transporting Hong Kong into Richmond. It's just a strange, very surreal sometimes mix. And what they've created, the population of Asian Canadians here, are a series of malls that are developed along this street, number 3 Road. They're all clustered here. They're called things like the President's Plaza and Aberdeen Center and so on. They're malls that are not based on the American model. They're not based on the Gruen model. They're malls that are based on some weird hybrid. But the main difference that I can tell you that makes a difference is that they're condo malls. In other words, you don't rent from the landlord, you buy your space from the land developer, which means that you don't have to listen to the mall architect. You can, or even listen to the landlord. You can do whatever you want with that space. So suddenly there's a kind of laissez-faire attitude or structure that's introduced into something that was a completely controlled environment. So you get these really weird juxtapositions of a Hello Kitty gift store right next to a fish market. And then 2 months later, it turns into a Canto Pop boutique. And because there are no leases. The problem with American malls is that there are 8-year leases typically, and sometimes 15-year leases. So the kind of vitality that you don't get is based on the fact that no one changes, and a business can go belly up, and there's no motivation for any change. But in this kind of condo mall model, there's much more of a city-like structure for ownership and evolution. So this is Lansdowne Center, which was a 60s development based on the Gruen model, which is a complete failure now. It's the largest area of parking lot unused in Canada, probably. This is all parking surrounding. It's 50 acres. And so we chose that as a kind of hypothetical site for a project that we wanted to use to propose a much more kind of intense use of space and much more messy development of retail and housing and public space. And it's based on some of the ideas that came up originally in the China proposal. This is a model that we eventually installed in the U.S. Pavilion in Venice. It's quite large. It's 12 feet wide and 24 feet long and 8 feet high. And I'll get to the problem of how that became an interesting conceptual problem itself. But first, I just want to explain our model, which is, again, like that Chinese diagram. The big box store would exist on the first level. The small box retail would exist in a kind of waffle slab layer where people buying retail spaces would literally buy a plug-in module, and this layer is not based on the street model that most malls are based on. It's a courtyard model. So the clusters of plug-in modules, which are these red volumes, would be, the circulation, for example, would be much more of a puzzle, much more like a bazaar, less clear, like the Gruen model. And then above that, you can't quite see it on this slide, but there's a ground plane, which is the landscape layer, which would be a public park, partially funded by bonds that are issued by rich men, partially funded by the developer, and then a series of housing blocks above that. Now, this housing block idea is unique to Richmond, because in Richmond there's a high water table, and you can't have parking below, and it's next to the airport, so you can't have flight, because of the flight paths, you can't have towers. So really, it's organized almost like a kind of horizontal tower. So these are some images of the model. You get an idea of what's going on the roof, and then a series of courtyards with these housing blocks hovering. Circulation from the upper layers to the lower layers are concentrated around these courtyard nodes. And these are some examples of those plug-in modules for the tenant spaces. And this is a typical courtyard with tenant spaces that are surrounding. So this is a typical storefront, and it's open to the air. Sometimes you get views down into the lower zone, which is the big box zone, and this is also integrated with parking, which would be a series of nodes. Because it's a 50-acre site, you wouldn't be able to put parking into one garage, but you'd probably distribute the parking throughout the site. This is a kind of typical proportion for a Costco type of shelving system. And these are just some diagrams, plans, and axonometrics of each of the floors. This is a first floor level plan with a shelving system. So the kind of waffle slab level with the plug-in modules, and then the roof with a series of courtyards. open in the sky, and then the housing blocks above that. So anyway, that was the kind of system or model that we proposed, but I just want to finish tonight's presentation with a few images of how this thing actually got produced, which turns out to be just as interesting a problem. A 24-foot by 12-foot by 8-foot model is something that is very difficult to move from Los Angeles to Venice. The other problem was time. We didn't have a lot of time to produce this. So it was a trade-off. Did we want more time to work on the model, or did we want to finish it quick and early enough to get onto a ship, which takes about a month to get to Venice? And we opted to buy time, which meant that we had to get everything onto a plane. And if we could do it right, we could get everything as checked baggage onto a plane. And so this is the 24-foot by 12-foot by 8-foot model. And we decided that, you know, we would take the money that they use for shipping and just pay for 4 people to go over to Venice and, you know, have a nice time in Venice. And we just had to do it right so that we could put this thing together in a few days. And thanks to SCI-Arc's new toys, we got a chance to laser cut a bunch of parts here. I think we used about 18 hours of laser cutting time, but we used this material coroplast to cut every part of the waffle slab very precisely. Everything was drawn in Rhino and then assembled. This was the test assembly in our office, but actually that joint's actually one of my proudest achievements, I think, because it's not it's just a dowel. I don't know if you can see this, but I have to go back. Oops. That's the joint. So it allowed us to put that whole structure together on site in about 2.5, 3 hours. And then the other parts were also cut in LA and then reassembled in Venice, taped together, and then the whole thing became a party. So I'd like to just finish tonight's presentation with some images of the people in the office that have worked with me over the last few years. Going back to what I said earlier or beginning the talk, that, you know, it's really been a very close-knit community that I've been a part of, SCI-Arc, and in fact, almost everybody in these images somehow is related or involved with the SCI-Arc community in some way or another. But you know, we've been really lucky to have a very vital practice, and it was designed that way, and it's not easy to maintain, as I learned recently. Someone said, for every day you neglect your art, it neglects you too, which I definitely learned. But you know, we've been in this particular space. We've been going for about 6 years now, and for 6 years in a row, we've had an annual trip to someplace in the world. Last year it was Venice, and the year before that it was Tokyo, or Rotterdam, and the year before that it was New York, and the whole office goes, and it's paid for by the clients, I guess. But you know, it's been a design to make this kind of practice that really continues to question and to really not take anything for granted. We, as you can see from what I showed tonight, we do a lot of different types of work. I still don't understand how people trust a bunch of punks to design 1.5 million square foot shopping centers, but as we go along, we somehow get more and more confidence and legitimacy. But the tough part is still finding people to work with you that enjoy the same questions and the same kind of commitment. And so I want to thank everybody that's been a part of this. A few people are here tonight, Sandra and Linda Hart and a bunch of other people, and obviously thank Carol, my wife, who's also in the audience tonight, and finally to thank all of the